Well, responding to the person who wrote in, asked if we might speak to the bombings in Paris, I thought I should go online and see what was being said in the news. I don't follow, my news following is very sporadic. It was interesting. It colored a lot of what I was thinking. Because what I found, first of all, of course, the terrible tragedy of I don't even call it a tragedy, a horror of what happened in the photos and videos, which I haven't watched, people's response. Christian Science Monitor said these were the deadliest attacks on French soil since World War II. And that evokes, a pretty strong feeling in people. Someone said it's reminiscent of the aftermath of 9/11 in the US, where, 3,000 people died, actually, in the end, roughly. The day before the Paris attack, 43 people died and 239 people were wounded in Beirut, also from a terrorist attack. Completely kind of washed over by the news in Paris. I looked further. So in April of 2015, 147 people, mostly students, were killed in an assault in Kenya. Does anybody remember this? Just a few months ago. Major. And then, in the United States, as of October 1, so that was 6 weeks ago, 274 days into the year, there were 294 mass shootings in the country within the U.S. borders. And a mass shooting means 4 or more people were injured, including the shooter. So, if that statistic holds up, there'll be over 380 deaths this year and 1,000 injuries from mass shootings. So, Venerable Chödrön addressed this, yesterday when she was speaking about it, but it also brought me back to, as Buddhists, how do we think about this? Here is something so vivid and violent and shocking. So first these emotions come up, like what are they? We're outraged, or we're terrified, or we're shocked, or grief. I think grief very majorly comes up. But and for us who are practitioners, first of all, to take this opportunity, like we do with everything, to use it to help us deepen our understanding of our own minds, to help us deepen our understanding of the Buddha's teachings, and to help us cultivate the qualities that we aspire to in order to be of benefit in a world where these things happen. Right? So, first of all then, I was thinking, okay, why does grief come up? Really, I don't know these people. Do I grieve for humanity as a whole? Do I grieve for sentient beings as a whole? If I did that, then I would just be in grief constantly because as a whole, we're born, we die, we're born, we die. Some of us die violently, some of us die suddenly. It's not that. So my grief comes from my own bias, right off the bat. So maybe it's Paris. I've been there. I know it. It's European. It's familiar. I'm of French origin, or that's more important to me than the people in Kenya, unless I'm Kenyan. I can say personally, of all the tragedies this year, the shooting in Charleston is still the most deeply grieving. Why? Because I'm a white Southern woman born in Jim Crow South and grew up during the Civil Rights Movement. It's personal to me. I get it. That doesn't make my grief not okay. But it makes me to pay more attention to the fact that my suffering, or the thing I understand, is no more important than the suffering of the parents of those children or students who were killed in Kenya, whose grief is not so moving to me. I can be sad, I can regret it, but I don't have the same emotional connection. There's something fishy about that. Right? My other thought then is that my personal definition of grief is that grief is what happens when your life has a head-on collision with the four distortions. What are those four distortions, as we recall? Holding things that are impermanent by nature to be permanent. Holding things that are unsatisfactory by nature, to be in the nature of happiness or bliss. Holding things that are impure by nature to be pure. And holding things that do not have a permanent, solid, independent, self-identifying characteristic that makes them what they are, as having that, as being that. And so again, we come up against something like this tragedy, or this, I don't want to call it a tragedy, it's a funny word for it, this disaster, this attack, this act of violence in Paris, or Kenya, or Beirut, or Charleston, or Roseburg, Oregon, or wherever. We come up against these things and we're shocked and we're outraged because we think things aren't supposed to be like this. Things should be permanent. People shouldn't be this way. Life should be lovely. We should all care for each other in a beautiful way, and nobody should have any kind of different way of being. Things should be pleasant. I shouldn't have unhappiness in my mind. I don't want to have to be shocked. Furthermore, somebody else out there that's solid and real must be to blame because I'm suffering. We go right there with those things. And so, I'm not saying this to diss our reaction. I think it's true that we are shocked because, as His Holiness says, we're shocked by violence because it isn't really our nature. And to then take that act of violence and our shock and not analyze it, and not also notice that what you're seeing and being bombarded with is a whole lot of news about what's wrong with the world and things that are going to be terrifying to us, is not the whole story. We also need to apply some wisdom there. A woman had written a poem which I do not have the rights for, but she put it on the internet, so I think it's reasonably public. It's not Paris we should pray for, it is the world. It is a world in which Beirut, reeling from bombings 2 days before Paris, is not covered in the press. A world in which a bomb goes off at a funeral in Baghdad and not one person's status update on Facebook says Baghdad, because not one white person died in that fire. Pray for the world that blames a refugee crisis for a terrorist attack, that does not pause to differentiate between the attacker and the person running from the very same thing you are. Pray for a world where people walking across countries for months, their only belongings upon their backs, are told they have no place to go. Say a prayer for Paris by all means, but pray more for the world that does not have a prayer for those who no longer have a home to defend. For a world that is falling apart in all corners and not simply in the towers and cafes we find so familiar. It's powerful. She's right. And we have the capacity to do that kind of prayer. That's my view as Buddhists, how we respond to situations like this. First of all, I've told this story before, but recalling the teaching of His Holiness, when the Abu Ghraib photos were released during the Iraq War, I was at a teaching with His Holiness in Toronto, and someone had asked him about how the world is falling apart. And first of all, he said, I disagree. Said, from my view, there is a growing kindness in the world. And then he proceeded to remind everyone, 24,000 people in this Colosseum, how much kindness there was in the world in this very moment. Think, he said, about all the school children who are in school right now, learning to read, getting an education, learning about the world, developing good values, more than ever in the world today. people are being educated to a broader view than their own little village. Think, he said, about all the people who are receiving health care right now all over the world. Health care unprecedented, really, in the world. The level of care, what medicine can do, the sentient beings who have been devoted to developing ways to deal with disease and illness. In this very moment, hospitals are filled with people who are being cared for well, competently, by people who do care. Think, he said, of all the children being put to bed right now, it was an evening talk, by kind parents who are trying to instill values in them all over the world. And if we let our imaginations go and think about the kindness happening, it's endless. We could do this meditation for hours. And that kind of kindness doesn't, the numbers don't add up. I don't care if you say 239 dead and wounded, 120 dead and wounded, 47 dead over here and 200 and some odd wounded. Still, the kindness that adds up when we start thinking that way is enormous. And that's where we have to put our confidence and our faith. That's where we have to look at our own hearts and go, okay, what are the things that still come up in me that bring about my own violence, my own anger, my own reaction? It's my self-centered thought. I can list my afflictions just like everybody else has. Every single one of these people, living and dead. Just like that. Do I also have a commitment to kindness? Yes, I do. Can I use this opportunity to nurture that, to deepen my faith in our capacity as living beings to cultivate our kind hearts and to overcome the afflictions that drive us to do acts that harm others? And we have the taking and giving meditation, which helps us to really work through for ourselves and also be of benefit to others, to be able to take on that suffering, to take on the suffering of the victims, to take on the suffering of the perpetrators, knowing that we have as much rage in our minds. It expresses itself differently in this life right now, we hope. But I know what anger feels like. I know what rage feels like. I know what it feels like to be helpless, and I know what it feels like to fight back. I have all of those things in my experience, and I can draw it in my body just like that. It's not a very comfortable feeling, and I can take on the suffering of that and let it shatter the self-centeredness that makes me care more about people in Paris than people in Kenya. The self-centeredness that makes me care more about what I know and is familiar than something that's just not about me, right? So I can look at my biases and let that expand my imagination to begin to exercise my capacity to be able to hold all beings equally, to cultivate my skill to be able to enact that wish that all beings be free of suffering, all beings be happy and have the causes for these, all beings reside in equanimity, free of bias, attachment, and anger, and all beings to have joy. The joy of liberation, the joy of fulfilling their potential to full enlightenment. So, I want to honor that idea that responding to such a situation with grief, shock, and horror is natural. And really appreciate His Holiness's observation that we react that way because our nature is not that. But then we go on. We experience that, we notice our feeling, we acknowledge our feeling, and then we think, okay, how do I practice with this? How do I use this? And how do I not give in to discouragement, but deepen my faith in our capacity as living beings to overcome these things and to cultivate our good qualities so that knowing that killing will continue until we're all completely free of our afflictions, I can still function, I can still contribute to the world, and I can still hold sentient beings in the light of beauty, seeing our capacity to become Buddhists. Yeah. I know I've gone on, but Venerable Children, can I quote you again? You said, May we develop a kind heart that wishes all beings, victims and perpetrators alike, to be free of their suffering and attain the happiness they desire. May all beings understand the causes of happiness and suffering, and not in ignorance create the causes for suffering in an attempt to create the causes for happiness. May we cultivate kindness, compassion, and equanimity for all beings and model those values for others. Being imperfect beings, may we do our best to create peace in our chaotic world. That's our job.